Hello everyone and welcome to lesson 4.1b. I've entitled this video, The Growth of Slavery. This video is going to cover pages 87 to 89. The growth of slavery. By the time Europeans were sailing to the Americas, slavery was widely practiced in West Africa. Many West African kingdoms enslaved those they defeated in war. Slave traders from Arab lands bought some of these enslaved people. Others were forced to work in gold mines or farm fields. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas created a huge new demand for enslaved workers. Colonists needed a large labor force to work on their plantations. West African slave traders sold captives they gained through wars and raids. Slavery and the slave trade became major parts of the colonial economy. For enslaved Africans, the voyage to America usually began with a march to a European fort on the West African coast. There, they were sold to Europeans who loaded them on ships. Now we can answer a couple of questions. Number one, during that time in world history, where was slavery being widely practiced? In the West African kingdoms. Number two, what was a common way that a person became a slave in West Africa at that time? Well, if you were defeated in war, they would take you and they would make you their country's or their place's slave. Question 3. What created a huge demand for West African slaves at that time? Well, the concept of the plantation in the colonies, making tobacco, making eventually cotton, making indigo and rice, all these plantation crops were very labor intensive, and so slave labor was used. Question 4. What became a huge part of the colonial economy at that time in our history? The concept of slavery and the slave trade. So not just the slaves working the fields and the things they were making, but also just buying and selling slaves was also a big part in the southern economy. Question 5. For an enslaved African, what were the first 2 steps of your forced journey to America? Well, your first step was you were marched to a European fort that was built somewhere along the West African coast. And then secondly, you were sold to Europeans who then loaded you onto ships. The Middle Passage. The trip across the ocean was called the Middle Passage. This name came from the fact that it was often the second or middle leg of the 3-part route known as the triangle or triangular trade. People called this route triangular because as the ships traveled between their destinations, their paths formed the 3 sides of a triangle. And we can see that on both maps, from Europe to Africa to the Americas to Europe. Or over here, from Europe to Africa to the Americas, back to Europe. Question number 6. What was the Middle Passage? The Middle Passage was the trip across the ocean from Africa to the Americas for the slaves. Question 7. In the triangle trade, what did ships from Africa transport to the America? They transported enslaved Africans. Question 7. In the triangle trade, what did ships from the Americas take to Europe? They took raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, cotton. Question 8. In the triangle trade, what did ships from Europe take to Africa? Well, they took the manufactured goods. So they would take the raw materials like the sugar, the tobacco, the cotton, and they would convert that into things like textiles or clothes, rum made from some of the sugar, and other manufactured goods. So they basically processed the raw materials into manufactured goods, and then they would trade those in Africa for the enslaved Africans, and then the whole process would repeat again. The Middle Passage was a terrible ordeal. Chained together for more than a month, prisoners could hardly sit or stand. They received little food or water. Africans who died or became sick were thrown overboard. Those who refused to eat were whipped. And now we can answer a couple of questions. The book states on number 9 there that the Middle Passage was a terrible ordeal. Based on the text, give 4 examples or pieces of evidence that support that claim. Well, number 1, they were chained together for more than a month. I mean, that in itself is brutal. 2, they could hardly sit or stand, so very crowded and cramped. That doesn't look comfortable. 3, not getting any food or little food or water, just enough. And 4, they cared so little for you that if you died or became sick, they just threw you overboard like garbage, like trash. They didn't even care about the person that was being mistreated like this. And then lastly, those who said, no, I'm going to fight back by refusing to eat, they whipped them. So these are all examples of the terrible ordeal that was slavery. And if you didn't catch it, look at this map. Look at this, what it says. 10.005 people got out of the Middle Passage alive. Look at that. 2 million people died in the journey from Africa to the Americas. 2 million people. Those who survived the Middle Passage faced another terror when they reached American ports, the slave market. There they were put up for sale as laborers to plantation owners. And now we can answer question number 10. What happened at the slave markets in American ports? At the slave market, slaves were put up for sale, and then they were sold to people who were plantation owners who wanted them to use as laborers. The life of the slave. Some enslaved Africans on plantations did housework, but most worked in the fields. Many enslaved workers suffered great cruelty. Owners of large plantations hired overseers, or bosses, to keep the enslaved Africans working hard. So question number 11. What work did most enslaved Africans do on American plantations? Some did housework, but most worked in the fields, in the plantations, on the fields themselves. Question 12. What job did overseers do on a plantation? Well, the overseers were the bosses, and it was their job to make sure that the enslaved people were doing their job working hard. And you'll notice in both of these pictures, you see a whip. So overseers had full control, full reign over the cruel treatment of the slaves in the fields. And the whip was just a symbol of that power. Many colonies had slave codes, rules governing the behavior and punishment of enslaved people. Some did not allow enslaved workers to leave the plantation without the slaveholder's written permission. Some made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. Enslaved people were seldom allowed to move about freely or gather in large groups. Punishments ranged from whipping for even minor misdeeds to hanging or burning to death for more serious crimes. Enslaved workers who ran away were punished severely when caught. Although enslaved Africans had strong family ties, their families were often torn apart when a slaveholder sold a spouse, parent, or child. Many of the enslaved found strength in their African roots. They developed a culture that drew on the languages, customs, and religions of their African homelands. Some enslaved Africans learned trades, such as carpentry, blacksmithing, or weaving. Skilled workers could sometimes set up shops, sharing their profits with the slaveholders. Those lucky enough to be able to buy their freedom joined the small population of free African Americans. And now we can answer a couple of questions here. Number 14, what are 3 examples of the slave codes at that time? Well, we can do a couple right now. Number 1, some couldn't leave the plantation without the slaveholder's written permission. 2, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read. 3, it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to write. 4, enslaved people were seldom allowed to move about freely or to even gather in large groups. These are just a couple examples of the slave codes at that time. And you can see other examples on this picture right here. Question 15. What were some of the punishments slaves would receive for breaking the slave codes? Well, they could range from as serious as whipping to even more serious, hanging, burning to death. I mean, think about that. These punishments are severe. Question 16. What would happen to an enslaved person who was caught trying to escape? They would be punished severely. We're not going to go into all the details in this video, but if you do a little research, you can find out some of the ways that enslaved people were punished for trying to escape were extremely brutal. Question 17. What cruel event sometimes happened to enslaved African families? Well, they were often torn apart. Mother, father, children split from their family just because their labor was needed somewhere else, or just to be mean in general. But really it was more about, okay, I can afford this particular enslaved person but not that one, so they would be split from their family. Question 18. Why was it helpful for some enslaved Africans to learn a trade such as carpentry, blacksmithing, or weaving? Well, this was helpful because at that point they might be able to earn some money. Notice they had to share that money with the slaveholders, but then they might be lucky enough to have enough money saved up to actually buy their freedom. That happened to a small percentage of enslaved people, but a very small percentage. Question 19 is on the next slide, so we're going to wait for that. Critics of slavery. Not all colonists supported slavery. Many Puritans, for example, refused to hold enslaved people. In Pennsylvania, Quakers and Mennonites condemned slavery. Eventually, the debate over slavery would spark a bloody war between North and South. Question 19. What were three groups of religious people that spoke out against the cruelties of slavery? You had the most prominent would be the Puritans and the Quakers, but then you also had the Mennonites. So the Puritans, the Quakers, and the Mennonites, they all said, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing it. And question 20. What war was foreshadowed when the book stated a bloody war between North and South? That bloody war would be the Civil War pictured here. Nothing civil about the Civil War. You had North against South. Well, thank you for watching. Before we go, I have a picture I'd like to share. This says, my 10-year-old is not having it. The question on the test was, what increased the need for slaves? And the student, who's only 10 years old, realized those people did not need slaves. What a great point. Well, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.